Yes, good evening. My name is Morgana, and although I'm British, I've lived in the Netherlands for about 30 years, and that's where I've worked and also introduced gardnerian Wicca. It's quite a difficult question to answer because it's something that I've always been, and it's like saying, you know, what's it like to be a child? Or I think it's important to perhaps say what it's meant to me in my life. Okay. As a witch, I've been able to perhaps do things that many people would say it's rather like fulfilling a dream. I felt it was something like a calling, and as a young lady, I was a teacher, I'd been trained as a teacher, but I had this calling to do something for humanity. And my greatest wish was to become a priestess. Around me, I had seen in the church, the women didn't really have a specific place, and if they did, it would be a female priest. And I wanted to be a priestess. And so my journey started in search of what it would be like to be a priestess. When I started looking, I realised there were many radical changes. This was we were talking about the late 60s, early 70s. And we were perhaps the first generation after the Second World War who, as women, were allowed to be qualified and to become actually who we wanted to become. And as I started travelling, my big wish was to travel. As I say, I had been trained as a teacher, but I really wanted to travel. And my first port of call, if you like, was the Netherlands. And it was actually in the Netherlands that I found out about something called Wicca. But at that time, I still wanted to travel, so I left the Netherlands after 3 years. I didn't intend to stay quite so long, but I left after 3 years and made the overland trip to India. And that was where I found, perhaps I was rounding off something of a past life, but there was something about, it's good to know how the Hindus, their kind of spirituality, but I felt the calling was really in the West. Yeah, so I came back. And to cut a very long story short, I was on holiday in 1979. I'd come back from India, and I was on holiday with my husband, or partner. And we had the great fortune of meeting some people in England who actually had a coven and were able to tell us a little bit more about Wicca. At that time, covens were very, very hidden in a way, not because they didn't want to be, but the climate still wasn't far enough that people would accept if you actually came out and said that I'm a witch. It was still very, very difficult to be actually visible.
Even there.
We did become initiated, the two of us, as we set on the path as a pair, as a working couple, and also as life partners, which was very, very, for me, very encouraging because we were able to help each other. And certainly in the Netherlands, Wicca was absolutely unheard of in a general sense. So the first thing we did was to begin a magazine. Just to come back to how we actually started, at the time there was very, very little known about Wicca. So we began a magazine just to really kind of inform people about what we were actually working with. Of course, that was one of our major focuses, to actually help people to understand what Wicca is. One of the things I first realised was people would actually say what Wicca isn't, but we tried to say what Wicca is. So in fact, coming back to the whole question of what were the prejudices, we tried to give correct information without saying we're not this, but to say what we really are. Wicca is a nature religion. It's because we try to build up our connectedness with nature and learn from nature. So nature has a very, very central part in our religion. But the heart of Wicca is actually as a mystery religion. And when we say it's a mystery religion, I try to say to people, it's your mystery, it's the way you feel about life, and part of Wicca is self-development. but also to include all the, you know, your family and your whole community. So it's part of unravelling the mysteries of life. When I was initiated, the emphasis was on the initiatory way, but it has become a little bit more open, and today people are beginning to realise that it's actually a religion which more people can actually partake in. As an initiatory way, as a priesthood, it inevitably means that we don't actually have a congregation, which can be an advantage and a disadvantage. I think to be initiated means that you really have a calling, but there is a huge commitment, but it's not for everybody. Oh, absolutely. I always say to people, you do not have to be initiated to revere nature or to revere the gods. But I think there is a difference between somebody who is prepared to take on the role of a teacher or a guider, or somebody who is coaching new people. So I think that there is a big difference between somebody who chooses the initiatory path and somebody who wants to revere the gods in their own way. And I think there is certainly a place for both. And many pagans would have a different, just kind of gradations. You know, it's not just it's either this or this. You know, we all use magic, but many of us are not actually aware of it. I think the difference between a magician is being aware of what you're doing. One of the things I think about magic is that we're actually trying to change people's perspective of how they actually see themselves within a particular situation. So we're actually, via the magic, making people also aware of how they stand in the world. So for example, if you came to me and said, I have a really bad back, could you do some magic for me? I would actually say to you, well, try to talk to you, but actually talk to your soul, if you like, and actually have a conversation with you, but why are you having these problems? So part of the magic is, first of all, to look at the person holistically, and then to start saying, well, how can we actually inform you to help yourself? So as a witch, I always say to people, it's rather like weaving the information we can actually perceive, and then using our knowledge, our own insights, to actually, again, weave the magic so that you will also understand your own situation. I always say to people, it's rather like saying electricity is harmful. Well, of course it is. If you put your finger in a socket, you're going to kind of blow up. For me, magic it's partly energy, but it's also partly information. And sometimes the information can be negative. It can also make people actually really, really question. So is that negative or positive? It depends how you perceive it. Again, it's a question of perception. But I understand your question. I feel that it's necessary. If you are going to do magic, you also need to know about cursing. You need to know about baneful magic, so that you know, from an ethical point of view, what you're doing. And I think this is a big difference between somebody who does magic, is not aware of what they're doing, and somebody who is an adept and master and knows what they're doing, exactly knows what they're doing. And I think for people like myself, we also have to be honest with ourselves and to say sometimes, I cannot do this, I am not competent. So there are going to be situations when perhaps somebody comes to me and I think, really, I am not the person to deal with this, and I have to be honest enough to the person to say, I think you should go to a regular doctor or a psychologist, etc. Okay. So coming back to the antlers, the image of in some of the religious art, we can see the rays, and quite often rays really symbolise the connection between heaven and earth, or the cosmos and the earth. And for me, the antlers have always been a kind of a spiritual antenna, and it's also perhaps a symbol also of the masculine connection of the vegetation side of life. To see the horned god, for me, is certainly not a solar aspect, that has very much to do with Earth. So the antlers have always been, for me, something of a great source of masculine energy. So I think the horned god reminds us that Wicca really is an Earth-based religion. It's we're not a solar religion where we think of another religion, but we really are much more Earth-based. So, and you're talking or asking about the triple aspects of the goddess. For me, it's the goddess is something which represents the continuum. So that the different phases are also very close to the phases in the chronological life of a woman. Chronologically, we have the different phases, maid, mother and crone, very important in the life of a woman, according to fertility. There is also the connection with the moon. That's what's fertility, yeah. When we look at the phases of the moon, there are actually 4 phases. So quite often we talk about the maiden as being the first quarter, and then the full moon, which is the full aspect of the mother and casting a lot of light. When the energy of the moon is at its height, and then you've got the waning moon when the energy becomes gradually less. But there's also the aspect from the actual last phase. And then how does the moon come back to the first quarter? Yes. And how does the goddess then come back from the... So how does the female aspect, in a sense, go back from being the hag or the old woman to the virgin or the young maiden again? I think this is also an important phase. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that not every witch believes in reincarnation. The moment that's probably what you get with paganism and Wicca in general. Once I say something, then somebody says, no, that's not what we believe at all. So reincarnation, just to make it quite clear, it's not specifically Wicca. The way we believe and what we believe about after death is perhaps more personal, because it's not a specific part of Wicca theology or philosophy. Of course, we do believe that there is perhaps life after death, but not specifically that we will come back in a specific body, although we do talk about the wish to come back with the people we love and our own family. And certainly our ancestors are very important, so it would be a general wish to come back to our own family. Absolutely. Yes, the Wheel of the Year is something, or the name we give for the seasonal festivals. Yes, we're looking now at a pictorial representation of the Wheel of the Year. Just let me orientate myself. Oh yes, you've got Midsummer at the top. I'd just like to point out there are actually 4 solar festivals and 4 what we would call agricultural festivals. It's interesting because the Wicca year or the witch's year begins with Samhain or Halloween, which is actually in autumn. And this is probably because we have the habit of starting things with a period of rest. Rather like, we were just talking about reincarnation, it's rather like the soul having a period of rest, repose, and then beginning to think about coming back to Earth. And as the wheel turns, we move towards the winter half of the year, when it looks as if nature is very, very quiet and not very active. But in fact, there is much activity under the Earth. And when we get to the festival of Yule, or winter solstice, many northern tribes or people in the north would have become rather anxious because the sun was gradually disappearing, and it was, is the sun going to come back? So the emphasis in the northern part of Europe would definitely be on the winter solstice, because they would want the sun to come back. And we see the Wheel of the Year actually being through rituals to remind us of the whole seasonal cycle, and how various seasons will in a way tell us what to kind of expect. If we know that spring follows winter, then we can start beginning to preempt what is happening in the year. Well, this is a complete workshop, of course, but I'll try and be brief. Just as I was saying, that the Wheel of the Year, and specifically the solar cycle, but specifically the moon cycle, is very important to actually surviving. And I think in the Neolithic times, and perhaps a little bit closer, it was actually the moon which was more important than the sun. Because the moon we could actually see within a period of 28 days, approximately, you could actually see the moon rising and waning. So the moon was a lot closer to us, as we could observe it much more closely. But of course the connection between the moon and the sun is very important. So I think for ancient man or woman, the moon was more important, but as we gradually became more aware of the sun, then the emphasis starts to change. And as human consciousness begins to shift towards a more solar consciousness, then the moon magic starts to begin to be not forgotten, but repressed. And of course, moon magic is something very close to women because of our connection with the moon cycles. But of course, as we saw the rise of Christianity or Judaism, then the shift becomes more towards the solar mysteries, and then we get the phenomena of the Christian calendar actually using old pagan festivals. But instead of emphasizing the moon aspects, the sun aspects becomes more important. So for example, we have the birth of Christ at winter solstice, and the emphasis becomes on the sun being reborn as Sol Invictus. And then of course the connection with the Mithraic rituals is very, very close. The strange thing is that modern pagans and some of my own witch friends have actually kind of reclaimed the Christian festivals, but with a Christian emphasis. So we get the strange phenomenon that suddenly winter solstice becomes the festival when the god is born, when in fact the old emphasis would have been the light returning, the promise of light returning, not specifically the God being born. You see where the emphasis starts becoming Christianized, and modern pagans have taken on the Christian idea of a pagan festival. So just one of the points that I'm just very briefly trying to make is that as pagans we should actually be looking at the seasonal cycle, not Christian doctrine or Christian mythology, if you like, or cosmology. And another wonderful example, of course, is Easter. Easter does not actually appear in the Bible. So fundamental Christians will say anybody who celebrates Easter is really a heathen, because the festival is actually Passover, Pesach, and Easter is actually derived from Eostre, which is the goddess of dawn, a northern pagan goddess. And this is one of the aspects which I, as a witch, as a Wiccan priestess, are also trying to help people to really look at their own pagan heritage. I spent 30 years in the Netherlands talking about Wicca and developing a Wicca network in the Netherlands. And many of my Wicca friends were also obviously in England, and around about 1971 something called the Pagan Federation was started. And one of the main missions, if you like, of the Pagan Federation at the time was to provide correct information about paganism, anti-defamation work in other words. It's a short primer based on a set of articles that were written in 1980. And it was when we started the magazine. I wanted to write a series of articles about what Wicca is. And the 8 articles were then translated into Dutch, which became a booklet which we used for many, many years. But it was only in 2008 when this became an English edition. And I decided not to actually revise it, so it's still 8 articles of a very young Wiccan priestess who was very enthusiastic then, and I'm still very enthusiastic now. And it's not a how-to-do book, but it's a guide to help people to find, to go back to sources and actually become more familiar with, again, their own pagan heritage.
Thank you for being here. Su se ljudi uvjerili da nisu baš vještice tako opasne kao što...
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Kao što ljudi.
Hvala što ste me pozvali.
I
hvala vam.